And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome,
Hi.
welcome. You are now with the Thomas Berry Forum for Ecological Dialogue at Iona College, which is part of the Kathleen Degnan Institute for Earth and Spirit. And we're very happy today to have with us Dr. Joe Holland. I'm letting you know that we're recording this so that it can be used in our archives. And we've also suppressed the little signals, the doorbell for entry, so you may not have to worry. If you have to leave, we're not going to have to chase after you. We're going to be here until about 12:55 today, especially for those students who might be joining us, who are, in terms of a class time, looking at that. Right now, Joe Holland is our visiting scholar for the Thomas Berry Forum. Today is the first of a three-part creative immersion by Joe into the implications and potentials of Thomas Berry's ecozoic vision. Today's session is entitled Returning to Nature, an Historical Framework for Activating the Ecological Renaissance. There are two more sessions to follow, one on March the 23rd. Title for that one is A Liberating Cosmovision for Building an Ecological Civilization. And then we'll conclude in April, on April 20th, with Joe's presentation called Imagining and Inhabiting Ecological Communities for the Future. So that's our plan for this part of the year. We're happy that you're here for this one. I hope it's a useful experience for you. I know it'll be enlightening and informative in many directions. And I'm going to ask Kathleen now if she'd be kind enough to give a more complete introduction of Joe and welcome him to our session.
Thank you, Brother Kevin. And welcome, everyone. I am so delighted that we could all join together today for the first of three sessions with our Thomas Berry Scholar in Residence, Dr. Joe Holland. Joe was a good friend of Thomas Berry's and in many ways a collaborator with him in the development of his thought and in the promotion of Thomas's thought, which we have committed ourselves to explore at Iona College, and where we are, in a sense, serving his legacy. We have selected Joe Holland to be the first awardee of the Thomas Berry Award that we will give annually at Iona College for someone whose life's work is really committed to what Berry called the great work. And surely Joseph Holland's is such a life. I'm going to ask my brother Kevin to continue to admit folks while I share something more developed about Joseph's background. Joe Holland is an eco-social philosopher and a Catholic Christian theologian who explores the ecological, social, and spiritual breakdown of Western-rooted, but now globalized, modern industrial colonial civilization, and the philosophical, scientific, and spiritual search for a postmodern, global, electronic, ecological civilization. And Joseph will be unpacking all of those terms for us today. Joe Holland is a visionary. And like Thomas Berry, he has an enormously insightful understanding of the developmental process of history and how it brings us closer to or farther from our deep desire as a human community to live sustainably and wholesomely. Joe completed his PhD at the University of Chicago in the fields of ethics and society, and also with interdisciplinary links to theology, philosophy, and social science. He has studied with the greatest, really some of the greatest minds of the last century for sure, and has had a very global or international formation in his own right. One of the things that's so important, I think, about Joe is that in the 1960s and 70s and further on into the 80s, Joseph was really a collaborator with, I would say, the most progressive leadership in the Catholic Christian world, particularly in the United States. And in that role, co-authored the encyclicals, Appalachian encyclicals that were so groundbreaking and formative, really the first ecological, um, I'm sorry, encyclical, This Land is Home to Me, which Joe can speak of if he wants to later. But why we wish to salute Joe is because of his lifelong dedication in the 16 books that he's written, in his collaborations and his professorships across in universities across the United States and internationally, bringing forward a vision of the future, which is so important to us now. And so may we all welcome and celebrate Dr. Joe Holland, Berry Forum Scholar in Residence at Iona.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Joe, at your beginning, we're letting people know that the chat room is open. If you want to ask questions, you can just pop them in the chat room. We can't get to everything, of course, today, but if you are struck by something that Joe has said, you may want to add it to the chat, and we'll look at those as we get toward the end of the time. Thanks.
Okay. I have to share, seeing Paquita here, I have to share a story that Paquita and I experienced we had with Tom Berry. Many years ago, my colleague Elisabetta Ferrero, we both taught philosophy together for over a quarter of a century at St. Thomas University. She's from the Torino area of Italy. We wrote a book together on the Earth Charter, a commentary, and Tom agreed to write a preface to it, which was very nice, very moving document. And the book, the first edition was in Italian, which Elizabeth translated. And we had a reception for the book in Italy. One, it's in Milan, and then in Rome, and then down in Puglia. And Tom agreed to come with us, and Paquita too. So I went, we got there a little early, and I went to the airport to Fiumicino to pick Tom up, and he got off the plane, and he had in his hand a little paper bag, like a school lunch bag, about that size, about that big, carrying it. And I said, well, okay, Tom, what carousel is your luggage at? He says, oh no, this is all I have. We're going to be, about 3 weeks, we're going to be there. He says, this is it, I guess. He truly was a Franciscan, I think. Unfortunately, he didn't bring a coat, and it turned out to be very cold, so we had to get him a coat. I thought that was a very, very beautiful story. I've tried to learn from Tom, and in some areas maybe go a little deeper because I have more time into some areas, and a few areas try to add a couple of insights. So today I have let me share my screen with you here. I should have put this up here beforehand, and I forgot to do that. I'll have to call it up. Yeah, here it is here. And I'll share it. Got to make it a little bit bigger. Just a second, then I'll share it with you in a moment. Okay, now I'll go back to you all and hopefully share the screen. So this is our first session. You all know about Tom and his life. I'd like to do two things. The main thing I'd like to do is go a little more deeply into what Tom spoke as the 4 ages in the human journey. He did that in his book, The Dream of the Earth. At that point, his earliest published book in this area of global ecology, the early tribal period, great civilizations, technological age, and now the ecological age. And my essay, written a long time ago, and I keep playing with it, Returning to Nature, was an attempt to unpack that a little bit. And that's mostly what I'll talk to. But I think because your university is host to the Berry Forum, you really are pioneering the university in the ecological age. So I just want to say, and in his book, The Great Work, as you know, he referred to four main institutions, the religious, the political, the economic, and the intellectual. And the university is the institution of the intellectual area. And he said that really, although perhaps the religious is the deepest one, the intellectual one is strategically centered because it's where people for all the traditions and all the professions, the next generations keep getting trained generation after generation. So unless you influence that, whatever you accomplish will be overwhelmed by a new generation coming out with the old, what we might call the old cosmology rather than the new cosmology. And I have an essay, which at the last minute I thought of just yesterday, and I sent it to Kathleen. I wrote it many years ago for the, when we had one of the first Catholic identity task forces at our university, St. Thomas in Miami, in the wake of John Paul's document Ex Corde Ecclesiae, which became famous for the mandates that were required. But it was a remarkable document that asked the Catholic universities to engage with the great questions of our times. And that was often overlooked. So I, along with my colleague, Mark Wolf, we were co-chairs of that. I wrote an essay, The Catholic University in what I now call the Postmodern Global Ecological Era. So I sent that to Kathleen. Those are the two things that I'll be sharing at. So again, the one comes from Tom's book, of course, The Dream of the Earth, and then the other from the great work. I'm going to try to unpack some maybe additional insights into those two things. I drew up a chart which I'd begun to develop in an earlier book on social analysis, but became more sophisticated later. And I'll just get that chart up here now. So I can make it a little bit bigger. I don't know if that's legible to you all. So I took Tom's four eras, renamed them primal, classical, modern, and postmodern. We don't really know when the primal begins. Could be very, very old, but classical begins about 3000 BC, about 5,000 years ago. Most of the history books say in the Middle East, but I probably the Egyptian and Nubian civilizations, in my view, are probably the most ancient ones. And then the modern bourgeois era begins in the around the 1500s, certainly with the conquest of the Americas, but primarily because of the printing press. And and then the postmodern era that we're in now. And I use the word postmodern differently than its typical academic use, which I see as late modern, not authentically postmodern, and as nihilistic. I see, for me, postmodern means ecological and truly after the modern. I think what is called postmodernist, or sometimes deconstructionism or post-structuralism, is really the unraveling of the modern, I think, but it's still locked within its prison. I took Marshall McLuhan's thing, four forms of communication. So it's like each different era has a different communication revolution undergirding it. The speech revolution here, you can see for the first one, the writing, handwriting for the second, and that use that broadly because in the Incas, for example, and the older civilizations, pre-Inca, Tiahuanacan and so on, had knotted ropes as a form of writing. They had a different technology of writing, but it was the similar communication system. And then finally, the printing press begins in the late 1400s to take power. An ancient Chinese revolution, but harnessed by the Europeans, makes possible the modern bourgeois world, which is a huge middle class that is university trained. So that's the university becomes central there. And now the electronic revolution, beginning in the second half of the 20th century, I think really is revolutionizing human life and the ecosystem of the planet in a way that nothing else has been capable of doing that before. These means of communication give us ever larger organizational structures. First, local tribes, up to about 200 originally, and then city-states and mercantile empires, particularly in the Italian city-states, Venice and Florence, and then nation-states. And nation really in Latin, natio, simply means tribe, except the tribes had gotten quite large. Nation states with industrial empires now, and now some kind of global ecological civilization that has not yet emerged would be where we would pointed toward. I should say, different than the modern progressive understanding of history. I see these things not in a linear manner or as one replacing the other, but as concentric circles, like the rings of the trunk of a tree, or roots growing deeper while the branches and leaves grow broader. It's an organic thing. We still definitely have people whose memories and rituals and from the primal area in the indigenous peoples across the planet are still with us. And so, and we carry, I would argue, we carry all of these, just as we carry in our DNA all life forms that preceded us. So we carry all social forms still with us, or not. One additional element of where I approach this, I came to much later, is I think that these four stages can actually be broken down into three waves of gender energy. There's a lot of evidence that the journey out of the primates of our early hominid primate types into this what became, the development of the frontal cortex, neocortex, and the development of humans with reflective consciousness is initially the fruit of women's intelligence. And that, who knows, maybe a couple of 100,000, I put 100,000 years there, maybe a couple of 100,000. I mean, it's a long, long period. And I call it matrifocal, not that it was matriarchal with women ruling, because I don't think that was the modality, but it was centered in the figure of the mother, and the great religious figure of that, of course, was the Earth Mother. Less so with those who migrated to the cold north, but certainly in the tribal and temperate zones, that seemed to be much more the case there. And so this is the ground. The second wave is the men's revolution, and then the third wave is a possibility of some kind of partnership. But the crisis we come to at the end of the men's revolution is different than the classical era. The modern era has been destroying the primal foundations, I would argue. Interesting, what people are doing in the crisis of the modern era who want to hold on to power, they're going back to the classical era to try to restore it. Those forms of authority, dictatorship, authoritarian dictatorships. I call that taking the late modern disintegration and trying to put an iron band around it to hold it together. But really what we need to do is go back to the primal, I think, and to women's wisdom in there. I jokingly say in terms of the book of Genesis that women got blamed for original sin. I jokingly say that the reason the serpent talked to Adam, or to Eve instead of Adam, is that Adam hadn't learned how to talk yet. He was in the background grunting. Now that's just a joke I make up, but that little girls in primary school develop physically, physiologically, and intellectually more rapidly, apparently, than little boys. And that may be a replication of what happened in human evolution, that women's intelligence seemed to emerge first. Some biblical scholars say that is the interpretation of the role of Eve. It was the women's, the mother goddess's temple, the women priests and the mother goddesses who controlled knowledge. The tree of knowledge, who controlled knowledge in the beginning. Anyway, so I kind of weave that through. So we have the sexual symbol of the first wave is the Earth Mother, the dominant one. I mean, they're all there, but the dominant one. And nature religions, not that nature is being worshipped, but nature is a sacramental mediator of the divine mystery. And the womb-like circle, even when you have the Chinese yin yang or the Asian yin yang, the harmony of the opposites, they're both enveloped in a circle. and the circle is a symbol of the feminine, regenerative feminine womb. And so the spirituality is primarily one of immanence, women's spirituality. The tendency is to make the male instrumental there. It's not fully developed yet. And that's why I think you begin to get a separate male revolution later that brings its own problems. In the classical era, it becomes the sky father, and we definitely know that all the three Abrahamic religions are very male-centered in a sky father: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. But there's also something unusual about them in that, because there are a lot of other Sky Father religions, that they bring this idea, all three of them, of justice for the poor. That in the Jewish case, Yahweh becomes a warrior who defends the poor and is a defender of orphans and widows. So that justice becomes, yes, warlike religions, but war on behalf of the oppressed. And certainly the Judaism is centered in the story of Exodus and the liberation of the slaves. I often say that, the white people came to North America, and famous, I guess, sermon that from the Arbella, that this is a new Jerusalem. And then the black slaves heard the story and they said, oh no, this is Egypt land. This is not Jerusalem. So there are two fundamentally different interpretations of the American reality they have there. But you notice from medieval Catholic theology and spirituality on, and you got this a great deal with John Paul II. Spirituality was defined exclusively in terms of transcendence, and there was a great fear of immanence. Immanence was seen as something that was opposed to religion. And nonetheless, I think one of the things that put me on this track was, I remember, I'm so sorry I can't remember this woman's name, but a wonderful scholar from India who taught at St. John's University. I was at some meeting about 50 years ago, and she said all the religions of the axial age are a flight from woman. that always stuck with me, So it's the second stage is the beginning of them. But what the masculine revolution did in its first wave here, definitely patriarchal, with the creation of aristocratic class, which was the warrior class, the conquering class. They conquered the tribal people who were still in the primal stage, and but they really didn't interfere that much with the ways of the tribal people. They came to be called peasants, but they were still the tribal peoples. By the way, several of us here have Irish ancestry, and prior to the Roman Empire, the dominant cultural, not ethnic, but cultural tribal tradition across Central and Western Europe, and even over into today's Turkey and Greece, was the Celtic tradition. And interestingly, we had the early Celtic church arise, which had a different understanding of the role of women and a different understanding of nature, but that was suppressed, beginning with the Synod of Whitby, and then with the Gregorian Reform, and finally with Cromwell, who obliterated in the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, who obliterated the clan tradition in Ireland completely, and that tradition was lost there. The modern tradition is bourgeois, and of course, in Marxism, bourgeois means the capitalist class, but I mean the older term. Bourgeois in Old French meant the people who lived in the towns, because the peasants, or the tribal people, lived out in the rural area, and the aristocracy, they had their castles out in the rural areas. They might have an urban house, but they lived out there, and they presided over the aristocracy, and both of them had a symbiotic relationship with the land. The aristocracy didn't get their hands dirty, but they understood very well how nature worked, and certainly the tribal peasantry did as well. So while patriarchy imposed a male warrior structure over the society, and that penetrated into the family system, nonetheless, the traditional, and until the modern era, the tribal traditions of nature and the mother goddess were still very strong. I think that's why the great devotion to Mary, the mother of Jesus, became so central in medieval Christianity as the tribal people began to be integrated more and more into Western Christianity. We know that the image of the Madonna and the Madonna and child is about 3,000 years old, probably originally from Egypt. There are, I think, something like 200 churches in Europe, and in Western and Central, and even into Eastern Europe, that have black Madonnas with a baby Mary, with a baby Jesus, both of whom are black, because the African church played a major role in evangelization. It was the North African evangelization prior to the conquest of Islam was more successful than the evangelization in Europe. Okay, so the bourgeois, though, are the people who lives in towns, and the towns were those who didn't work the land. It was a home of intellectuals and became the home of the universities. It was also the home of the lawyers and the physicians, the three professions of the graduate levels of the medieval university: theology, law, and medicine. But it was also the home of what were called the mechanics. And I grew up partly in Connecticut, and in New England, there was a series of banks. I guess they went back to colonial times, and it was called Farmers and Mechanics Bank. Those are the two things you did. Either you're a farmer in the rural area, or you were a mechanic in the city. What did the mechanics do? They built artificial things. They could build a stagecoach or wheels or all kinds of things. And it was out of these artisans that the Industrial Revolution really grew, along with the sales commerce as well out of that. So, but they were in the city, even though the first factories in England were in the Midlands and rural areas where they could avoid the legislation of the medieval guilds. But bourgeois then came to mean urban, and I think and it meant male. So, and I differ. I'd say the bourgeois era has not been patriarchal. It's worse. It's hyper masculine. It tried to eliminate the reproductive functions of nature with substituting for that the hypermasculine bourgeois technological production of artificial objects. So modern bourgeois technologies are now replacing nature and replacing nature and destroying nature. But artificial technologies are not inherently regenerative or reproductive. Interestingly, it's one of the things why there's, without getting to anything about the morality of birth control or abortion about that, but there are great battles about human reproduction going on in society. At the same time, there are great battles about natural reproduction here. That it really is a hyper masculine modality in which the society is completely organized, not supporting family life and not supporting children, and above all, not supporting nature's reproductive capacity. Coming strictly out of the male imagination, and to stay with the gender metaphors, it is reaching its climax and it is already collapsing in there. Okay, this phallic modality. So what we have here, we have the women's technologies originally, which we don't have many archaeological remnants of that because they were biodegradable. They were using nature, and women's spiritualities were down. Then we came the male technologies, particularly after the Iron Age, the development of metallurgy, and which gave men power with weapons and tools, and particularly the heavy metal plow, whereas women would have controlled agriculture before and still by and large do in areas of Africa. And then the men's spiritualities of transcendence. And out of this comes monasticism and higher ways. And that fits in very well with Platonism and Neoplatonism in the West, this kind of duality there. And you get a priestly religion, and I call it, rather than a womb-like circle, it's an upwardly pointed phallic line, like the steeples of the on churches or the steeples on mosques and so on. Interesting, the Eastern churches never got as completely into this, Catholic and Orthodox. And you'll notice they generally have a dome, as does Islam, have the dome along with the steeple in their architecture. The Romanesque churches had the dome, but the Gothic ones eliminated there. So, okay. So the modern bourgeois era takes a fundamentally different cosmology. Still, in this one, the primal cosmology survived, but it was subordinated. Now there's a new cosmology. I can talk more about that later. Comes with the retrieval of the atomistic philosophy of materialism of Epicurus, a post-Socratic Greek philosopher who we knew the West came to know through the writings of a Roman philosopher, in-law of Cicero, Lucretius, and his famous book De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, which was a book-length poem. So here what you get is the print revolution, of course, makes possible the explosion of the middle class, explosion of these new male technologies, and it's just been skyrocketing ever since then. Peaking, however, climaxing and collapsing now, I think, but it becomes secularized. Nature is stripped, especially by the Protestant Reformation. Although that began in late medieval Catholicism. I always say Protestantism was a Catholic invention. Luther was an Augustinian monk, and Calvin was a Catholic lawyer who went to the same Jesuit college, or the same college that Ignatius Loyola had gone to. They were almost there at the same time. But the men's technologies secularized the material world that gives permission, spiritual permission to exploit it. Huh? And then spirituality becomes interior, back to the womb-like thing, but privatized and individualized. That begins in a very beautiful and good way with the Devotio Moderna of the late Middle Ages, and with Teresa de Avila and San Juan de la Cruz, John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, interior castles and stuff. Ignatius of Loyola picks it up in his spiritual exercises, but they retain the Catholic awareness of the beauty and goodness of the divine mystery revealed in the outer world as well. But the bourgeois urban tendency is to find meaning inside and then secularize the outer world to manipulate it. And then you begin to get this, what I call sibling rivalry between a kind of symbolically feminine religion, which is controlled nonetheless by men, but men in the West who don't have much to do with women, celibate men, and then this mechanistic hypermasculine science. Even though the founders of it all were all Catholic, eventually they begin to split and set themselves against each other. So kind of cyclical interiority against a linear exteriority, the famous modern subject-object split. Now we're coming back into some kind of a holism, and nothing will happen, and I'll turn to this in just a little bit, nothing will really happen with any power until as Tom Berry pointed out, until the cosmology is fundamentally transformed, and that must be fundamentally transformed at the level of the university itself. But the university, by and large, with a few exceptions, is still on cruise control for the modern atomistic, mechanistic cosmology that comes from that comes from Epicurus and Newton, and I would add Bacon in there. It's a conquering one too. Conducting what Rachel Carson called a war against nature, particularly a chemical war against nature. This new one, and here I draw on my mentor from my graduate studies, Gib Winter, who was a Episcopal priest and a professor of theology, social ethics at Chicago, had been one of the principal proteges in sociology under Talcott Parsons in Harvard and had broken with him. But he spoke of this as a artistic root metaphor. He's the one that put me on the root metaphors. So the root metaphor is entirely different. But all the disciplines of the university are still unconsciously grounded in the atomistic mechanical root metaphor. That has not been transformed. So it isn't enough just to do a couple of things here and there. It really requires, therefore, what I've called a postmodern global ecological renaissance, like the Florentine Renaissance of the 15th century, or the medieval Renaissance of the 12th and the 13th centuries in Europe. Nothing short, and this time, however, it must be global, with all world religions participating in all schools of philosophy. And nothing short of that otherwise, all the other efforts to solve the ecological crisis will fail, I predict. And this has some kind of a feminine masculine synthesis in spirituality, and understanding that we now know that sexuality and gender is a spectrum as well. That's a given, but the co-creativity of all of that together. And it is the creator sharing co-creativity with the creation, which in turn becomes co-creative. But it must have the harmony, this yin-yang harmony of these poles and everything in between there, in a new ecological spirituality that I call the fertile embrace there, okay? And that becomes then this post-generative revolution, and we could talk a lot more about what it would mean, and maybe I could say more about that, Bassett. But that's the frame of reference. I'd like to jump now just quickly to the evolution of the Catholic University, and I'll just be real brief here, but my essays will be available through Kathleen. Rounding things off to 100 years, I think few academics today really understand or appreciate that the Catholic Church invented the Western university system. Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna, Prague, Paris, the Sorbonne. These were all Catholic universities to begin with. They grew out of cathedral schools and monastic schools, often typically under papal charter. And they came out of the medieval Renaissance, which was a very powerful one. Not time to go into it here, but Western Christianity had been dominantly using as its expression of reason for faith and reason, the Platonic or Neoplatonic tradition. It's actually a modern term, Neoplatonism, the Platonic tradition with its dualism, hierarchical dualism, that went very well with the aristocratic cosmology. Suddenly, Aquinas, having learned at the University of Naples, whose first rector, requested by the emperor, was an Irish scholar, a Celtic scholar, who brought some Irish scholars from the south of Spain, where the Bishop of Toledo there, Raimundo, had the famous Convivencia, where he brought together Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scholars to translate all the great classical texts of Western civilization, which had been translated from Greek into Arabic, and then they translated into Latin, and it went over to Naples, and Aquinas studied under an Irish Celtic scholar there, and from there it went up to him to the University of Paris, and then so Catholicism, at least in its systematic theology or foundational theology, moved outside the Platonic framework into this hylomorphism, holism of the Aristotelian tradition, and which was much more congenial to sacramentalism, of course. Earlier, Christians couldn't figure out what to do with Aristotle because he had held that the body and soul were one, and therefore, when the body died, the soul, of course, died with it, which Epicurus also held. But they forgot that Jesus had preached the resurrection of the body and the renewal of the heavens and the earth. Meanwhile, Christians, including Ignatius of Loyola, in his spiritual exercise, continued to speak about, in Platonic terms, saving souls, and after death, having the soul go to heaven, which it had been alienated from since the fall. You will not find the word fall in the book of Genesis. As far as I know, if you are exiled from a garden, you walk out sideways. You don't fall down. Fall is the term that Plato used for the souls that had fallen into the world. So Aquinas broke through of that imprisonment in a really dramatic deviation from the holism of Jewish rabbinical preaching, of which Jesus was a part, and restored it. However, he restored it to philosophical and metaphysical thinking. It was not restored to the spirituality, because the monastic tradition, which was still Neoplatonic, still held control over the spirituality and the idea of saving souls and going to heaven. Even a priest was called in Latin, or in Spanish, a cura, from the Latin, and in English we call that a curate. Cura animorum, a care, the one who would take care of the souls, just as the physician would take care of the body. You can see the Neoplatonic dualism right there in those two things. So anyway, the Protestant Reformation breaks free of that Catholic control, which had been become intellectually degenerate by that time, and it creates it finds its home and base in, especially the German, free university. Not really free, because it was under the control of the local prince, who would eventually become Protestant, but free from papal control. And it was so the early modern Protestant university, and that carried over to the United States, to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, and Rutgers, which were the Ivy League schools, which were really Protestant seminaries to begin with. And even until I think certainly late 1800s, early 1900s, the president of these universities would teach a seminar in ethics, which would be partly biblical, partly Kantian, to all the seniors to graduate. It still was under this hegemony of the Protestant establishment in the United States. That, of course, disappeared in the 20th century, and we got the strictly scientific, oops, typo there, strictly, I'm mixing my Spanish with, there. Spanish doesn't have an S before scientific. Strictly secular scientific university. That began in Germany with the Alexander von Humboldt's founding of the University of Berlin, I think around 1810. It was picked up over here in the United States with Cornell and Johns Hopkins becoming the first scientific universities in the model. And of course, then we had technological schools like MIT or Worcester Tech and all kinds of schools like that that would focus on science and technology. And then when the land grant colleges came in, all the state universities that emerged followed this model of the secular scientific university. This, by the way, is the model in which, by and large, the faculties of our Catholic universities, apart from theology, and even there somewhat, are trained. They don't know anything about Catholic social teaching. They are still in the old cosmology. That is, and as a result, our Catholic colleges and universities have retreated into an attempt to save Catholic identity by, oh, let's make sure we have a serious theology or religious studies department, campus ministry program, and a chapel. But all of that is presiding over the late modern secular scientific university that's there, which is in fundamental intellectual and spiritual crisis, I will say. We're finding a breakdown of meaning. The sort of veneer of Kantian philosophy and Kantian ethics, which held together the Protestant establishment intellectually, has collapsed. And with post-structuralism, postmodernism, we're now we're going into nihilistic, voluntarist nihilism, which there is no meaning. And the only, and everything is fragmented to disciplines. Those are Epicurean atoms. And because young scholars can't find any meaning to it, and the only thing they can do to advance is immediately they begin to do niche specialization and maybe get refined in some little thing, but they can't talk to you about anything else because they really don't know very much about anything else. And so it's a crisis of meaning and a crisis of the intellectual life. The Catholic Church, as a major intellectual force in Western civilization, and now as a major intellectual force across the entire planet, where the majority of Catholics, like the majority of Christians, live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, could become the intellectual leader of humbly, as a servant, in partnership with all world religions, and especially with the primal nature religions, of a truly postmodern global spiritual intellectual renaissance. Some universities, and wouldn't it be wonderful if Iona were one of them, could become small pioneers of beginning to be prototypes for that kind of model. It doesn't mean you have to revolutionize everything. It just means you have to begin planting seeds that will begin to blossom over the long run there. So that's an overview. I think I'm on time to stop, maybe a few minutes early there. I'll stop sharing my screen, and any questions or dialogue we could have there, or unless you have to go to something else.
Joe, this is Kevin again.
Yes, Kevin.
Thank you. That was stunning. That was stunning. There was so much. It's really going to give everybody a couple of, perhaps even a couple of nightmares, but still wonderfully illuminating and certainly expanding. And I thank you for that as a wonderful beginning for this this little adventure we're on here for this semester. I know that there are some things in the chat, and there are some things that are also happening inside Jim Robinson. We've asked Jim to be the first respondent today, to take the microphone and see if he can move things along, and then we'll come back and forth as we're going in and out. Kathleen can also be jumping in from time to time. So Jim, if you want to unmute yourself and speak to us.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much, Joe, for that really comprehensive and clarifying offering. And I have a question that comes out of Return to Nature. Throughout the essay, you point to the important contributions of spirituality and spiritual experience. For instance, you highlight the power of recovering a sacramental worldview, or recovering the capacity for sensing the universe as the primary revelation of the divine. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how we might actually embody this, how we might actually experience a sacramental world, how we might experience the universe as the primary revelation of the divine. Can you point to spiritual practices that you find particularly helpful, or theological resources that you find particularly helpful? I'm even thinking, maybe of Laudato Si as a potentially helpful theological resource. But I'd love to hear more about that. And thank you again, Joe.
Thanks, Jim. Before getting into that, I just have to say one thing back to, what Kevin had said. One time at a talk, a Jesuit said to me afterwards, trying to listen to you is like trying to drink water from a fire hose. So I have to apologize if it comes too strong, fast and furious. But back to that, yeah, definitely interesting. The sacramental tradition became heightened for Catholicism in the medieval period. Christopher Dawson wrote that the reason the West became so rich and creative in the medieval period, he said this is a key to the resilience of civilizations, is the incorporation of the Germanic tribes, the quotes barbarian tribes. It was that gave new life. And I think they were, all the tribal people lived in this nature religion, in which the entire natural world was a sacrament. That's where it comes from. And so that brought a huge infusion in, and Aristotle was more sympathetic to that because Aristotle was not a Greek aristocrat. He was from Macedonia, from tribal peoples. His father was a physician. Probably, the colonists would have called him a witch doctor or something, the colonizers, but he was still himself a practicing physician and also a marine biologist. But he brought nature in. For Aristotle, and there were lots of problems with Aristotle, his terrible misunderstanding of women, his terrible understanding of tribal people and slavery. But those are not endemic. Those are not rooted in his method. Those are rooted in his conclusions. They can be easily eliminated, but his method is to be grounded in nature. So everything must be grounded in nature, as Tom Berry said. Now, of course, where is the first place for nature to nourish us is get as far away as we can from things done by mechanics, although I love mechanics myself. It's but I mean, to get into nature itself, spend time in nature. I think to live in an urban bourgeois world isolated from nature is inherently despiritualizing. That's why the more urbanized we become, the less spiritualized people we have, de-evangelization, unless you try to fill it with some kind of crazy neo-Calvinist millenarianism that some of these bizarre evangelical movements, and evangelicalism itself is very good. I taught at 3 evangelical seminaries. They're wonderful pastors, but these bizarre theologies are filled they fill the vacuum with things that are really demonic, that are turned to violence and hatred. So spending time and living as much as possible in nature, I think also, and so Paquita does a lot of gardening, spending time with plants. And also animals, having animals around us, not living in isolation from the animal world. Interestingly, there's a new phenomenon on our street. We live in semi-rural Florida, and all kinds of people now have chickens now. You can't have to drive down the street carefully because they're out pecking in the middle of the road. And interestingly, we had a cougar come through recently that ate 4 chickens, and people saw it in their backyard. So nature is still around us anyway over here. But that definitely, Laudato Si, I want to say something about that. Certainly, it does a wonderful job of bringing ecology center stage. And at the end, as you know, of course, Francis speaks of right after strategy of ecological spirituality and ecological education. However, I would say, those are the things about which he has the least to say. There's very little said about it there. And if you read other things coming from the Vatican about spirituality, it's just not even there anymore. It disappears. So and I would say, to my mind, one of the great pioneers of writing in this area is your own Kathleen Degnan area. I think this should be a leading edge of work, ecological spirituality, because what the tendency is to reduce eco-spirituality to eco-ethics. And that's what happens. So we should care for the earth with stewardship. Well, certainly we should. Definitely, I'm totally in favor of that. But that's not eco-spirituality. That's a consequence of eco-spirituality. Yeah, that's a consequence. So unless we recover the consciousness that everything, our bodies, the ants, the birds, the stars, everything is spiritual, is sacred. And I think even the book of Genesis, God said, "Let there be light." Well, the light is the incarnation of the Word of God. It's the first incarnation. All of creation is the first incarnation. We have a second incarnation to heal the woundedness, but if we try to live with the healing without the first incarnation, that's like thinking you should live in a hospital. You know? No, there's a big world outside the hospital, big world there. You know, so recovering the sacredness of nature is foundational, and the people who most understand of that, and among the two dominant genders are women, and men are women. So women, I think, should lead the way in helping to recover. Somebody told me one time, if you go into an office building where, say, there's 50% of offices belong to women and 50% belong to men, you go in at night, there's no names on the door, you don't know which. And so I asked my students, what do they say? How can you tell the difference in the offices? Some people say, oh, the women's offices are much neater. And I say, no, and I have a daughter to prove that. But anyway, actually it looked very neat, but if you looked inside, everything was chaos. But and so then they say, oh, it has more photographs. No, it turns out plants. Almost always in a woman's office, there will be plants. Very seldom will you find plants in a men's office. So the symbiotic relationship with nature comes from women, and it was patriarchy first to demote it, and then the hyper-masculine to trying to convert women into men so they could function in the mechanical system equally with men 24/7, so to speak, without being interrupted by childcare, without being interrupted by menstrual cycles or anything like that. So it would all function smoothly. The machine would function smoothly. It wouldn't have any rhythm to it. Wouldn't have any regenerative cycles to it. That's what modernity does, yeah. And so the modern bourgeois era, and so the most important thing, including Jim, that we can do, I think, in terms of something to do, I say are eco-villages. We have to return to model the way of living in nature, in a wonderfully lovely, very happy, abundant way of life, including using technologies. And here I think the Catholic worker made a mistake in that. Peter Morin, for heaven's sake, was not anti-technological. He used the printing press immediately. And in those days, those were massive, monstrous, ugly machines, but used the technologies, solar energy, satellite dishes, et cetera, computers, in symbiotic relationship to enhance our relationship with nature there.
Hi, Joe. This is Kevin again.
Yeah.
And I think, Jim, you got your question answered, and with the cherry on top. I think it might be appropriate if we just move a little bit to hear from Kathleen, who got a lovely shout out just now. And Kathleen, you may have a comment or a suggestion or a question for us, for Joe, or for the audience. You may have to unmute. Kathleen, you may have to unmute.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you so much. I will be happy to drink from that fire hose anytime. I feel that what you offer us is so compendious. You are such a systematic and architectural thinker. You really have allowed us to move with you in our understanding through these developmental phases and stages of our human enterprise, the glory and the peril. So, but here's my concern as somebody who lives within the academic world, but not only, because I know we have folks in our conversation here who are from many different worlds, but my concern is the imminence of the crisis, is the urgency, I should say, of the crisis. We are right up against what Merton calls the rim of chaos. And I think I agree with you wholeheartedly that the university is critical in this enterprise because we are, in a sense, the ones who are those who invite people into various paradigms. And I'm wondering, for any given university, college, school, parish, any conglomerate of human association, how do we accelerate our movement intellectually? Because we will not do it unless we can perceive it first and see it. How do we accelerate the movement out of this deadly death-dealing paradigm we're in, into that fertile embrace that you're talking about?
Yeah, Kathleen,
That's really a question for my colleagues and anybody else on this call. How do we accelerate that?
I agree. The roof is collapsing in on us right now already. It's beginning, and it's going to get worse. We have, what, 280 schools of Catholic higher education in the United States. A great deal of them will not survive. Just the financial crisis is going to be enormous. And the result is to make it even worse, to try to solve the financial crisis. We're putting people in charge in many schools who are actually making it worse. But two things, but one thing that can be done immediately, I think, is we have to begin dialoguing about the underlying philosophy of all disciplines, because the assumption is we don't need philosophy anymore. In fact, it's still there. Even Nietzsche said that most people are espousing ideas of some long dead philosopher whose name they don't even know. I mean, they're completely immersed in the philosophy of Epicurus. Epicurean atomistic materialism is the dominant ground, and Newtonian mechanism as well. And I would say Baconian hyper-masculine conquering. But we have to become aware how all disciplines are shaped by that. And that could be done fairly quickly, I think, and it would have power. But the second and more important thing is, I don't know if any of you saw, if anyone subscribed to the French Catholic news service, Crux International. Yeah. And I think about 2 weeks ago, there was an article about a Catholic nun from Paris who started an alternative university, probably under the umbrella. Imagine he has to get the degree from some existing university. I would say, you don't make a frontal assault on the institutions. You use an agricultural model, plant seeds outside of it that can develop new prototypes and be in dialogue with the mothership, so to speak. Yeah. So that's what I think we have to do. Begin to plant new alternative models of the university under the umbrella of existing ones, in which people can start living together and form these eco-villages. It's what Peter Morin understood this. Pierre Morin, he was French. He was a peasant, from Languedoc in the south of France. He didn't know quite what to call it. He wound up calling it an agronomic university. And he actually sent one of my dear friends, I hope she's still alive, Mabel Gill, who's the sister of Eileen Egan, and probably, Sean, you know her, yeah, well, and Tamar, Dorothy Day's daughter, send them out to Long Island University to study agronomics. That hopefully they could do something to do with it. Well, nothing came of that, but even the Catholic worker never knew what to do with this agronomic university. Well, now we know. Now we know what it has to be. It has to be an alternative university like this French nun is doing, something like that to create it. And I think there would be lots of people that would join into it and launch it. That's something feasible, could be launched within 24 months, I would propose, if we really picked up the idea.
Thank you, Joe. By the way, in the chat from Sister Jackie Hanrahan is a reference to that exact person, Sister Cecile Renoir.
Yeah.
The transition campus in the French town of Forges. And it is referencing your point there. So it's in the chat. If people want to save the chat, they'll have a reference for it. We're closing in on 1 o'clock. I thought at this point I would invite Kathleen to circle the wagon, so to speak, and bring us to a final point and give Joe a thank you and a send off. Kathleen, are you ready to say that?
Maybe. Oh, well, I could stay in this deep circle of conversation and dialogue for a long time. Joseph, I want to salute you. You're a master thinker. You're a master teacher. I feel that what you've offered us today, I'm so grateful that it's recorded, is going to be really potent, seminally so. the seed conversation that we're talking about here, I hope that we can bring on to, for example, our Catholic intellectual tradition program at Iona, so that we can, and I'm going to really ask that this conversation be audited by faculty and by the leaders of our university, so that we can have a mental framework, a philosophical framework for these paradigmatic transformations, the incipient one being the most important, the one on whose verge we are all standing and thinking. So, Joseph, I just want to thank you. That's my final word, is a word of thanks. I really do encourage all of our audience and our participants. First of all, thank you for your presence today. I hope that your mind has been expanded and in some sense organized. I've been cleaning out all of my cupboards and drawers lately. I have a penchant to put things in order, to make space for the new thing, or to just make space. There is something wonderful about opening a drawer that's empty. And I feel like that's what needs to happen. We need to make space in our consciousness, in our intellectual lives, for the new thing to spring up. You have planted that seed for us today. We promise you that we will nurture it throughout the Thomas Berry Initiative and also in the Institute for Earth and Spirit. We look so forward to being with you for our next two conversations, which will be longer, and we'll be able to go more deeply into these things that you bring forward for us today. But I think that we promise you that in your footsteps, we will all labor to be pioneers of this new ecological civilization that we are trying to build by our thought, our word, and our deed. So thank you to our scholar in residence.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Joe. By the way, reminder that the next part of this process will be on Tuesday, March 23. It's at 7 p.m. So look for that e-blast, which Kathleen will be sending in her usual wonderful style, for the invitation to come into your mailbox. The title of that one is A Liberating Cosmovision for Building an Ecological Civilization. That's pure Joe Holland right there. Thank you all. We're going to let you go, and we won't close the meeting abruptly, but we'll let you wave goodbye. And we'll see you next time, please God. Thank you all.
Bye, Rachana. Bye, Mary. Aurelia, welcome. Welcome all the way from Peru.
Thank you, Kathleen. Good to be here with you.
Welcome, Connie. God bless. Thank you, Mary.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you to the Agape community, whom we will be with on our third session.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Looking so forward to it. Eleanor,
I'll be there.
and most especially Joseph, thank you.
Kathleen, it's Frederica.
Hi, oh, Frederica, welcome.
I just sent you something. I think you and Iona need to know about this. There's an article in the New Yorker that's February 8th, and it's called Annals of Geography, Promised Land, a young climate activist is creating maps to help the Catholic Church combat global unity,
Yes,
global warming.
I've read it, right?
Oh, isn't that
You're right.
wonderful?
You're
Yeah,
right.
this is the Eco Village. This is to make all the Catholic lands. It's a great, great article. You've
Yes.
got, that's good. Very
Now,
good.
I'm
you
sorry.
so much.
I'm gonna have to run. I have to get my COVID shot. Okay.
And thank you so much, Dr. Holland. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Joe.
And hello to Eleanor Ray. Wonderful seeing you. Wow, a long, long time. Okay.
Thank you, James.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Jim. Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Brother Kevin.
Yeah, well done, well done, well done. And
Thank you, Brother Kevin. So wonderful.